Hi everyone, I'm Swati Pandey, online editor of Zocalo Public Square. I'm here today with Ted Gioia. He's a musician and author of 6 highly acclaimed books. He's here today to talk about his latest, The Birth and Death of the Cool. Thanks so much for coming in today.
No, I'm glad to be here.
So before you came, I looked up cool on Urban Dictionary, and none of the definitions they offered quite seem to match yours. How would you define the cool?
Well, most people think that the word cool has always meant what it means today. In fact, if you go back in history, cool used to have a very negative meaning. Throughout most of history, it meant aloofness, indifference, emotional distance. You have Hemingway, back in the 1920s, wrote, "I'd like to cool you," and another guy wrote, "I cooled a cop." And they're playing on a slang meaning back then, which cool meant to beat up somebody or kill them. Hardly stylish. But actually in the 1950s and 1960s, things began to change, and cool meant a certain way of acting, a certain attitude, certain mannerisms, with a bit of humor, indirectness, irony. And it was very important with the cool was not just what you projected, but how you were perceived. And really, coolness, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. And that's when I talk about cool. It's that composite that I'm talking about.
Why did that capture imaginations then? Why was indirectness and irony something people wanted in that era?
Well, I think you have to go back even farther. If you go back into the 1930s and 1940s, the Great Depression, World War II, people were struggling just to survive. If you told them they should be cool, they would have probably laughed at you. The idea would have been ridiculous, might even have been decadent in their minds. But you get into the 1950s, people begin to get comfortable psychically, financially, and all of a sudden they get this zest to be cool. And I think to really come to the grips of it, you need to look at another word that came out into the language at that time, the word lifestyle. Now, my parents, who grew up in the Great Depression, I can't recall either of them ever using the word lifestyle. That was the concept that was foreign to them. But all of a sudden, lifestyle becomes very important to people. And the idea that you could shape your life almost like it's a work of art becomes very appealing. Now, it's interesting. In 1967, the Chicago Tribune, during the course of the entire year, only used the word lifestyle 7 times. 5 years later, that same newspaper used the word lifestyle more than 3,000 times. Now, if you fast forward to today, most newspapers not only use the word lifestyle a lot, but most newspapers have what they call lifestyle editors. That's a common job at the newspaper, to have a lifestyle editor. So lifestyle really became the prism through which people began viewing the whole world and actually themselves. And I think it's the combination of those factors that created this great mandate to be cool.
Can you discuss a little bit about how cool and lifestyles became such a popular concept, and what's the relationship between cool and what's popular?
Yeah. Well, I think sometimes people use this word cool to refer to anything that's popular or anything that's even just acceptable. You want to go to dinner? Oh yeah, cool. But in fact, cool has a broader meaning in terms of certain behavior patterns and mannerisms that became popular in the 1950s. And the most interesting thing is where these came from. People began borrowing ways of acting, talking, dressing, behaving that came from the jazz community. And not just anywhere in the jazz community. Really the most eccentric jazz musicians of all. Lester Young, actually the person who invented the modern meaning of the word cool. Thelonious Monk, who would wear sunglasses and these berets. Bix Beiderbecke, Miles Davis. And really, I've studied this at great length. But still, it's surprising to me to think that average everyday people on Main Street in Topeka or Omaha would decide they needed to act like Miles Davis. But something like that began happening in the contemporary culture. See, the problem with cool ultimately is there's a certain neurotic quality at its heart. Cool is not defined by you. You may think you have the most righteous hairdo or the greatest running shoes, but they're not cool until people around you begin to validate them. So because of that, there's this neurotic quality of the cool that I always have to look outside for that validation. And I think there's a rejection of that now, where people are embracing more their internal values.
It seems like we still have some of that today. There are popular culture figures like Lady Gaga who cultivate an eccentric persona. Why is that no longer cool today?
Well, you do see this last residual element of the cool, but for the last 10, 15 years, cool has been on the decline. And it's interesting to see it across all areas of society. In my book, I show about movies, music, media, politics. It's interesting, the New Republic recently poked gentle fun at our president, saying, Barack Obama is really an uncool guy. But what they don't realize is that it's his very rejection of glamour and glitz and his embrace of what I call a new earnestness is part of his appeal, because that's what people want these days. Now, go back a few years earlier. Back in 1992, Bill Clinton is running for president. He goes on Arsenio Hall show, puts on sunglasses, saxophone, once again from the jazz culture, and tries to act really cool. He goes on MTV, talks about whether he wears boxers or briefs. That won't happen anymore. There's been a change in the public tone. It's interesting, when Obama was running for president, he was asked, "Do you wear boxers or briefs?" And his answer was, "I don't answer questions like that." So things have changed. And you see it in other interesting ways as well. There was an article recently in Rolling Stone about how humor has changed. And they talked about the new naturalism in humor. They talked to Lorne Michaels of Saturday Night Live, Conan O'Brien, various comedians, and said, the jokes we tell have had to change. People don't want these cool, ironic jokes anymore. They want jokes that are down to earth. And this, almost the same time this article came out in Rolling Stone, the New York Times Review of Books did an article about new fiction. And Scott Turow said, it's interesting. People now want these simple, down-to-earth stories about everyday people. Now, most people don't pay attention maybe to contemporary fiction, or there's a new sincerity movement in poetry. But I think even everyday people now can see just by turning on the TV that things have changed. And it's not just a glut of reality shows, but that's indicative too. Why would people want to turn on TV instead of seeing the cool stars? They want to see everyday people like themselves. But even more, what happens on these shows. I think by now everyone realizes the cool candidate always loses on American Idol. It's always gray-haired Taylor Hicks from Alabama beating sultry Catherine McPhee from Los Angeles, or overweight Ruben Stoddard beating Clay Aiken with his boyish looks. And it's the other reality shows too. Buddy Jewell on Nashville Star, overweight, unattractive, beating out drop-dead Miranda Lambert for this country western competition. And probably the most striking example of all is Susan Boyle. Britain's Got Talent. Within days of her becoming famous in the UK, she's famous in the US. And if you were going to put together a poster child for uncool, you'd pick this woman. And actually, this is the interesting thing. She became famous not for her singing. Her singing is mediocre, really. As a music critic, I have to say, she's not that great of a singer. She became famous precisely for her ability to personify the uncool. I want to make this clear. This is not just another trend. It's people are suspicious of trendiness. It's not just another style, but people are distrustful of stylishness. A new tone has entered the public landscape.